Good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine war. I'm remain your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center, and we welcome back Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia subject matter expert. Fulfilling our promise of higher tempo, we're bringing you another one here just within a week of the last one. And as things seem to go, sometimes it's been another sort of newsy week. So we have a few things to cover here, and we'll start with the one that was sort of just after our previous episode, where there were a number of notable strikes or explosions among Russian logistical areas. The most striking ones were there was an oil depot or oil storage facility in Crimea that had looked like it took significant damage and was burning for quite a while. But there have been some attacks on other oil depots or oil storage areas, as well as some of Russia's mobility hubs and lines of communication, such as railways. So, Yuval, welcome back. We'll go right into it. So we know that there have been periodic attacks of this type before, and they are very photogenic, if you will. Oil burning always makes for a good picture, but given the going after fuel and lines of communication for movement, what do you think this indicates in terms of why these targets are getting struck now?
So always a pleasure being on with you, Ian. Certainly, when we start to see the attacks on rail lines and oil depots, it was reminiscent of what were the shaping operations prior to the last counteroffensive, the one that was mooted for Kherson and in the south of the country, and instead there was a surprise attack on Kharkiv Oblast, and everyone was looking south. They went north, and they achieved tremendous success in terms of taking back territory in Ukraine's northeast. So it suggests perhaps the same thing is happening right now. We've been talking about the forthcoming counteroffensives for, I think, several months at this point. But perhaps, four of the most dangerous words in the English language, this time is different. This might be one of those right now, because the Ukrainians are going after rail lines. If they're going after fuel depots, it doesn't mean that Russia will run out of rail lines or they'll run out of oil. I think we both think that Russia has plenty of those. But it does mean that the amount of time it takes to repair those rail lines, the amount of time it takes to, bring in new oil infrastructure, that will take some time. And that might be, in effect, what we're observing are the shaping operations before the next counteroffensive. And really what this could very well be is that we know on, a different part of the conversations we've had for the last several months, that there's 15 to 20 brigades that have been training in Germany, I think in the United States, and basically elsewhere in NATO countries. All of those troops that have been training abroad on basically the donated equipment have not yet entered the fight. So what we may be observing is that this is the one. And so ostensibly, if the counteroffensive begins, and we'll talk about Bakhmut and the travails around that right now, it could very well be that the Ukrainians will start probing, see where the Russians do or do not defend, and basically either go with whatever is their plan A, or just try to seize opportunities and just get the counteroffensive going. Where they could go, obviously, we've been talking about the same things for a long time here, which is basically cutting off the land bridge to Crimea, going after the south, going to Melitopol and severing basically the connection of Rostov in Russia's south to Crimea. They're not too far away, as it were, from Donetsk city center. There's lots of things that they could go after, and that seems to be part of the Ukrainian basically strategy at this point is make believe that they can go anywhere as well as everywhere.
Yeah, and I think there's been a fair amount of speculation, online in terms of what direction we take, and I don't think it's fair to really sort of speculate because we just don't know. As you said, they may just poke for holes, and if they find one, go after it. Kind of regardless of whether it's close to a specific city or not. But as I said, I think the targets indicate it makes it harder to respond if you don't have gas and you don't have no way to move your reinforcements. And I think they're sort of mutually reinforcing things, right? Like as you said, the rails can be repaired relatively quickly. American soldiers, were good at rail repair back in the Civil War, right? So it's not a technically complex thing. Um, but looking at the oil, those oil storage areas, I imagine would be harder to repair, especially harder to repair and then resupply if you pre-stage a whole lot of stuff there, which means to give Russian mechanized forces that that gas to go. Now it's got to come on rail, and then if you go on the rail lines, that just got a lot harder. So a mutually reinforcing problem potentially.
So certainly, like it just means that if this is basically the strategy that they're going after, again, Russia has plenty of rail repair technology, but how much can they basically bring to those areas quickly? They have plenty of oil, but how much of the stuff can they bring quickly? And it means that if the Ukrainians do start their counteroffensive, all the reinforcements that Russia has to then bring in have to come from much farther away. And so it not only slows everything down, but it helps identify the Russian, supply lines that, Ukraine still has HIMARS. In the last several tranches of military support that the United States has given to Ukraine, basically like HIMARS and related items, related, missiles, rockets, things of that nature, the munitions, they've been in every single one of those tranches. So it could very well be that what the Ukrainians are trying to do right now is really identify like during the time of a crisis, where is Russia bringing the stuff? How is it bringing the stuff? And basically trying to attack Russia, deeper and deeper into Russia itself in order to just confound the Russian armed forces, as well as creating the sense of panic, amongst the Russian troops, and to whatever extent the Russian public is interested, amongst the broader Russian society.
Right. And I think this is a great segue into point number two that we were going to hit today. Speaking of striking deeper into Russia, maybe only a couple days ago, there was some very dramatic footage coming from some Russian security cameras pointed at the Kremlin, which is center of Russian political power, military decision-making areas, offices for those in charge. And we saw it got hit by a drone, or at least the story is that it got hit by a drone, because there are a number of stories about what may have happened. But the point was something on camera was caught flying in the roof of the Kremlin, and there was an explosion of fire, and it looked like there were some flames and debris on the roof there. And there have been all kinds of competing theories about what if it was a drone, who launched it, what's the motivation, and what would the various parties stand to gain from it. I could go a number of different ways with it, but as you mentioned when we started here recording, there's potentially sort of three theories at work here. So what are they, and what are the implications of each one, if that's the one that winds up being true or not, which we may never know.
So we should also mention one of the key little details there is that, so Kremlin, it just means like fortress. So like lots of cities have Kremlins, but when we think of the Kremlin, this is the medieval fortress that the Germans attacked in the Second War. The Napoleonic forces tried to blow up, but they had the relative misfortune, for their purposes, of it was quite rainy when they were trying to like blow everything up, and their artillery just got too wet to be of much use. So we have evidence of foreigners attacking the Kremlin before. The other thing that is sort of like the detail that will maybe help explain some of this is that the Kremlin is a fortress. There are churches inside of it going back several centuries. There's different courtyards, there's different contemporary government buildings, there's different palaces inside, there's the state armory, which is now a museum that holds like Russia's treasures. So it's in one sense both key decision making center, but it's also like lots of tourist stuff is inside. Putin does not live there. The last, I think, Soviet leader to live inside the Kremlin, obviously I could be wrong, but I think the last person to sort of like sleep there on like a nightly basis or on a consistent basis was Stalin. So Putin actually lives outside of Moscow, and he only comes into the Kremlin, he only comes into Moscow if there's some sort of specific event that requires his presence. one of the few things that Putin, as just like, retail street level politician, has done to sort of like improve the lives of Muscovites is that he doesn't actually go into the Kremlin very often, because whenever he travels, that's a huge security bubble that he requires, because he's a very scared man, and so he basically can single-handedly destroy Moscow traffic. He is the one-man traffic jam. So he doesn't often go there, and when he does go there, he goes there by helicopter. So part of what the Russian, official explanation is that this was an assassination attempt by the Ukrainians, and they say it was an assassination attempt because Kremlin, Putin, etc. Although that's laughable, but the thing that basically perhaps points to the Ukrainians, and we'll go through all the theories in just a moment, is that whoever was controlling these drones, which made some sort of small but highly symbolic attack, is that they attacked the flagpole of the Rush of basically the Kremlin. So symbol of Russian power, and then the symbol of the Russian state. They're attacking the flagpole. I mean, you can imagine if someone attacked the flagpole outside the White House. That's the most important flagpole in a certain sense in the country. So the first sort of theory is that this was the Ukrainians. And perhaps we can create a story or, construct a scenario in which the Ukrainians are basically doing their shaping operations. And part of that is, this is a kinetic action, but one meant to create basically information overload. It means that the Russian state and Russian armed forces look like morons because they can't basically control the airspace around the most important thing in the entire country. It also shows that Ukraine can strike literally into the heart of the Russian state, and that in essence, this in the days leading up to the May 9th Victory Day parade, it shows that even Red Square, which is right beside the Kremlin, which is where the parade takes place, and the Kremlin itself are unsafe places, and that this refers to just like the darkest chapters of Russian history. So theory one, the Ukrainians, for the cost of a mere several drones, were able to create true pandemonium in basically Russia's political elite. We've also seen on Russian news over the last couple of days is that there hasn't been like any showing, like any sort of like display of the actual drone footage. It's all over the internet, but it's not on TV yet. So that could very well be that the Russian state doesn't actually want to show we cannot protect, even the airspace around the Kremlin. Theory number two, this was a false flag attempt by the Russian state. And this is a false flag attempt by the Russian state, so obviously with Putin's, like, let's say, knowledge and approval, which has, because Putin probably helped, oversaw the bombing of several apartment buildings in Moscow in 1999, that helped create war fever against Chechnya, which allowed him to create much more of a public profile for himself, and which essentially created a societal wide desire for revenge. And in this theory, there's a lot of basically like hard fighting to come. There's a lot of bad news to come. There's going to be unfavorable casualty figures at some point that get leaked. There is a second mobilization that'll come, that'll be announced. And so in order to justify this bad news, they need to have basically a threat to the level of the that justifies basically another mobilization. We also had Dmitry Peskov, who is the press secretary of the president, Putin, who said that it was the Americans behind this. And so this creates the idea that, if we're fighting against an opponent as formidable as the Americans, we need all hands on deck. That's basically like the false flag theory. And in this theory, the idea of basically, we know from public opinion polling that the sharpest drop in public opinion, like against Putin over the past like year plus since this war started, was around the mobilization in September of last year. That's really the only thing that actually forced Russian society to pay attention to the special military operation. This is like lots of other societies who are fighting unpopular wars. As soon as people like realize that things are not going well, they do their utmost to tune this out. So mobilization needs to be something that the big phrase justification for it. Third, sort of like, and then there is the idea that this is the security services. And here, I'm reading on Telegram two different theories, and really, both of these are mildly insane. So one is basically the security services doing Putin's knowledge in order to create concentration in Putin's mind that if he doesn't sort of get it together and really get the war machine going, he's going to lose the war. And that this is basically a wake-up call from the security services directly to Putin. The fourth theory, and is the most outlandish, but let's throw it out there into the mix, is that this is done by Yevgeny Prigozhin in order to basically demonstrate much more explicitly the incompetence of his rivals from the Ministry of Defense and Russian armed forces. That he's the one who's able to show, Putin that he can do anything. And if he doesn't get, his way, which is basically like more artillery, more basically like military support, the soldiers will leave Bakhmut, they'll go northwest, and they'll be marching on Moscow soon enough. So take it or leave it. Those are basically the four horsemen of the dumbest apocalypse yet.
Four Horsemen of the Dumbest Apocalypse. I'm gonna have to consider that as a working title for this episode.
Yeah.
Although we have a couple options, other options that we can maybe use. But the bonkers thing about this is like there's potentially a logic to any one of them, and which in the absence of any further evidence, it's really hard to sort of untangle what it might be. On following the Ukrainian line is do they have the capability? Probably they've executed long range, against some of those oil storage areas we've talked about, or even the drone boats when they did that one of their attacks into Crimea with that, right? Like they can do long range, unmanned, uncrewed devices. We know that they can do that. The biggest question I think on that would be would injecting that level of chaos into society be worth potentially raising questions on Western capitals? I mean, possibly, most especially the U.S. does it look like they're striking a military target outside their own borders, which they've always said that they won't do? Would it be worth it to them to do that? I don't know, because it definitely makes Russian air defense look like it's not doing at all anything, especially since we talked about many months ago the Pantsir on top of the building, on top of the Ministry of Defense, right? Like that was a very visible. We are taking measures to defend you from those evil Ukrainians, and look, they just went right past it. So who
Not
knows?
For the first time, we've been asking, what air defense doing?
Yes, and it seems that even in what is probably, I think you characterized it before, as one of the densest air defense zones, probably certainly in Russia, possibly around the world. Yeah, you could still get a couple of drones in there, past all those layers of air defense. Yeah, I mean, as for the other theories, heaven only knows. But
we should note on this point is that the Ukrainians, like in previous attacks, like previous like really high profile attacks, they've had wink wink nudge nudge. We totally didn't do this. Like smoking is dangerous, like for your health, especially when you're by a high value military target. For this, they did say they like Zelensky on down denied responsibility. That doesn't really mean anything because certainly like President Biden and other European leaders have told them, stick to liberation of your territory, do not strike inside of Russia. But at the same time, this is pretty wild. Like this basically gets Russian decision making. It basically throws a wrench into all of it because they have to figure out how do we explain away just like an abject failure, an abject humiliation. This basically not since like Soviet times when a West German teenager flew a Cessna, and landed on Red Square, that led Gorbachev to actually fire, several of his top like military people. And in basically like the descriptions that I've read about this, like the scene where he was firing basically like the Soviet marshal who was in charge of like air defense, he screamed at them this with like a lot more swearing. this effing kid landed on Red Square. Radar's been invented since the 1930s. So even with like, the technology of the day, the Soviets weren't able to protect against this. They're not able to protect against basically like drones, perhaps, commanded by the Ukrainians. So
Yeah, and as you say that, I was like, okay, flipping the coin though, did Putin do this on his own? Because as you mentioned, he has no compunction whatsoever about killing his own people or arranging things if he thinks that there's some advantage to be gained. And maybe this is a way to, like, if you wanted to fire a bunch of generals, but you didn't really have a good reason, hey, you got a great reason now to fire them because what air defense was doing was nothing. So maybe if he didn't think he had sort of the support, you make them look bad, and then it's a lot easier to fire them. But then that also potentially changes into like the security service or Prigozhin, and this is the head's just going in circles. Like any one of these things you could follow, there's a path to it. But I guess speaking of Prigozhin,
yeah,
we can shift to him, and unless you wanted to talk anything more about the drone and the Kremlin.
no, I
But
mean, the, so this is the thing, and we'll sort of like as we move into Prigozhin, we always have two different images of like power in Russia. One is that Putin is like this dictator. It's basically whatever he wants. Like he points a finger, people scurry. But we also have it's sort of like anytime you see like Putin looking stern and whatever sort of photograph. But we also like can see that there are politics at the highest level. And the idea that lots of people could have an interest in doing something and could plausibly do it indicates that the amount of control that Putin has in terms of being able to balance all the different factions surrounding him may not be as strong as it was. And it may not be as strong as it was because all those different factions might have their own different assessment of basically what's happening in the conflict right now and how the future might look. All of this is to say, Putin definitely has like 100% control of basically like the formal state apparatus. But are people starting to think, are there different opportunities? Are there different dangers that come from, Russia perhaps observing that that basically Russia's offensive over the winter effectively did nothing, that Ukrainian counteroffensive is coming, and certainly at least we don't know how it's going to go because we can't predict the future, but we do know, as we've discussed, the Ukrainians are going to bring a lot of firepower to this, and they've been training for this and this only for quite a while now. So, in essence, this could be a lot of people trying to think, how do we get ahead, politically speaking, of what's about to happen on the battlefield? And that is where I think Mr. Prigozhin and his YouTube starring turn over the last 24 hours comes in.
Yeah, so let's launch into that then. So there've been, I guess I'd say not even on social media. These videos have made, they've been making, sort of front page, top of the web page headlines on, major news organizations. And there's a couple out there, and I'm not sure what the chronology of it was. I mean, you can probably get us into that, but there was one video, is a relatively long one where Prigozhin standing in front of some of the boys from the Wagner group he was basically saying, like, we've come and we've done all the heavy lifting in this area because we were asked to, but we've been starved of resources, to the point where our men are dying for no reason, and we're going to leave Bakhmut. Like, we'll wait until May 9th after Victory Day so we don't embarrass the motherland, right? But after that, we just don't, you've given us nothing to accomplish the mission, so we're going to go until we're called on again to come in and save the day, kind of thing. And then there was a shorter one of him dropping, the Russian equivalent of F bombs about every 5 or 10 seconds, conveying the same frustration in a much stronger fashion. And he was doing it in front of what are reportedly rows of his dead Wagner Group mercenaries, right? Like, kind of stacked on next to each other, fresh off the battlefield. But he was pointing to how this is the direct concrete result of not getting the ammunition and support from the Russian Ministry of Defense that he needs. And it's a dead man. I don't know if it's fair to say, but possibly the strongest directed criticisms yet against Shoigu and Gerasimov and the Russian Ministry of Defense in general for like who's really doing the work for this war and who's not?
I happen to have just seen those videos in the opposite order or in the reverse order, and then there's a third one that we can describe. So in that, the one that you just mentioned, for our viewers or our listeners who can who can speak Russian, like that's a monologue that'll go down in history. Um, for those who can't, it's obviously like the images contained in the video are are awful. So like we can't encourage you to like watch things that show like fresh corpses. Like it's awful. Like that's our disclaimer. But the way that Prigozhin basically goes about it is he actually speaks like a I, I hate to say this, but he actually speaks like a normal person. So unlike the odd illusions of like Putin whenever he speaks, or sort of like the bloodlessness of like literally every other bureaucrat in Russia, Prigozhin makes the decision to speak like you would hear any regular adult male. It was obviously like someone who's like super angry and like swearing a lot, but he sounds like a regular person. And he makes basically several charges in the first video. He's pointing, while he's saying this, to just like fresh corpses and saying, these were someone's fathers, these were someone's sons. What did they die for? We came here to do this job. We've been doing this job. But you, and he then starts to go directly at Shoigu and Gerasimov to say, you are the people who are, growing rich. You're growing fat in your mahogany offices. Your children are living in luxury, filming YouTube videos as the Russian people have asked them to do, are responsible for. You're responsible for basically, and then he starts to go on to really like hit home on the theme of artillery. He's saying that we used to get what we needed, but because and then he uses like criminal jargon, which is like hard to explain, but he basically says something effective, because you became afraid of my success. You became afraid of Wagner. You started to reduce the amount of artillery that you gave from everything that we needed to 70% to now 10%. So the casualty figures that we are anticipating are now 5 times as high. And then, he's doing this as he's pointing to like the fresh corpses. And he ends the rant by just like repeatedly swearing at Shoigu and Gerasimov directly and saying that, he addresses the commander in chief and he says, this has to be resolved. Otherwise, there's no way that we can continue the fight. In the second video, he basically like does like a he does the same rant, but without as many swear words. But basically says, we've done the fighting. We don't have basically like the support that we need. So we're going to leave on May 10th after a victory day. But because no one in the Russian Ministry of Defense or Russian Armed Forces has yet taken any responsibility for anything, what we're going to do is we're going to request the orders be given for us to be able to withdraw from Bakhmut. And he says, there's 45 kilometers of ground that we had to cover. We've gone to all but the last 2. We want to give this up to units of Russian military and Russian sort of armed forces writ large. We need you, bureaucrats in chief, to actually like take command of this, because we're going to go deeper into the rear. We're going to lick our wounds and we're going to wait for the Russian people to call on us once more. And so then he has a third video in which he basically recapitulates all of those 3 and effectively says, the people of Russia have been let down by basically their armed forces. And so by his swearing video is, we're going to leave unless you beg us to stay and supply us appropriately. And the third one of giving up basically all pretense of being able to do anything further. Prigozhin is effectively saying only Putin can basically force, his lieutenants to do anything. We've done everything that we could, and we were the only ones to do anything. And if anything basically like fails from here and we don't even get to conquer Bakhmut, then you know what? Let's not hang this on Wagner. Let's hang this on Russian armed forces.
A couple questions for you here before I go into it. I know we messaged each other before this, and one of the things that struck me about sort of that sequence of videos is Wagner's a bunch of mercenaries, war crime happy folks have been given guns and let out of prisons. But there's a stark contrast in Prigozhin in those videos compared to the people he was criticizing, which is say whatever else you want about him and Wagner, right? That is clear evidence they are at the sound of the guns. To include to that longer one without the swearing, you can hear artillery going off in the background. And there have been multiple instances where Prigozhin has been filmed at locations in and around Bakhmut, not necessarily the front line, but close enough to the front line that again you can hear the sounds of the gun. Pretty stark contrast from Shoigu and Gerasimov and Putin, who don't dare get themselves even within audible distance of things going boom. So both his like you said his tone, the words used, and then sort of the backdrop. It's a pretty clear contrast between him and who he's criticizing. But so with that though, like the only person he didn't sort of go after by name was Putin, but it sort of seems like he's there's no room left for him to sort of reel this back. Like this is all in his last will and testament, last stand. That might become literal. I don't know, but the point is like you can't take that stuff back. Like that is strong direct criticism of the Russian military and its leadership. So what does Putin and or the Ministry of Defense do with him now, or do now on their own? And maybe a separate question for you is:
Mhm.
do we really think that Prigozhin and Wagner would just leave? Is he trying to bluff to get more resources? And if he does leave, what happens to him then?
Yeah, so in so again, so as I was trying to introduce a little while ago, if Putin were, sort of like the true totalitarian dictator that many make him out to be, you wouldn't be hearing peep out of anyone. There would be very clear like message of discipline because no one speaks out of turn. Prigozhin is speaking out of turn, which sort of demonstrates there are clear rivalries. There's clear if if Prigozhin also had like the direct phone line to Putin, he wouldn't have to do this stuff in public. But he does. We can see that part of it is him basically standing for something that stands in opposition to the rest of the establishment beyond Putin. He doesn't criticize Putin because if he criticizes Putin, then that doesn't make sense. He exists as one of the many courtiers in like the Russian imperial court. So he's not going to basically like bite the hand of like the Tsar. That's not going to happen. But he is becoming a lot more popular, at least on the really sort of tuned in military blogging sites. His latest round of videos have gotten like near universal acclaim on basically like from like the Russian mill bloggers. Because for as you noted, he's there. When he's saying, like Shoigu and Gerasimov have been getting fat in their offices, those guys, like, you never see them break a sweat. Like Shoigu's children, like, are in Dubai. Like those things are real. So he's tapping into that populist strain of I'm the one doing like the fighting, my men are doing the dying, and my rivals are basically not helping. And at worst, they're actively trying to prevent Russia from winning because of their fear of looking stupid. So he's definitely going for more popular acclaim. Also, one of the things that he notes in his several videos is that when he and his like Wagner like private military company came to Ukraine from Africa, which is where he gets most of his money, they came out fully kitted. They came out like ready to fight. That they were successful in like their first couple engagements, anticipating that they would continue to be supplied. Obviously, that supply has dwindled up because Gerasimov and and Shoigu are responsible for the whole front. They're responsible for everything, not just Bakhmut. And so Prigozhin is also in a position right now where if his troops get routed because they basically are unable to continue the fight, Yevgeny Prigozhin without a private army is a guy who has a lot of enemies, and his enemies are much more successful at surviving basically like court politics behind the scenes than they are at conducting foreign war. So I think people like Shoigu and Gerasimov would have zero hesitation in killing Prigozhin as soon as they thought it was like the political right move to do. In all of that, Prigozhin is trying to appeal directly to Putin. He's trying to build his base of popularity amongst, like the Russian public writ large. But he also needs to make sure that basically his private army survives basically like the encounter with the Ukrainians. And he makes basically several like very clear allusions that the reason that his fighters keep getting chewed up is not because they're bad at fighting, is that they're not getting the stuff that they need. And the illusion being is that the Russian Ministry of Defense would not be too heartbroken if Wagner was actually defeated in the field, because that would remove basically one of their chief rivals.
Yes, although this goes back into a different thing we were messaging about before, but it potentially also removes one of the few forces that's had any notable battlefield success over the last several months. But winning, but winning the war in these core politics doesn't seem to sort of enter into the top three of the priority playlist here in terms of the special military operation.
Yeah, think about it like this. We don't really know exactly how many Russians have been killed in action. We don't exactly know how many casualties there have been, but casualties, tens of thousands, 200,000. We know just by like observing the empirical reality around us that Putin is willing to accept unlimited casualties, willing to accept unlimited killed in action. And therefore, like his minister of defense, his chair of the general chair of the general staff, they're also willing to do that. So therefore, the idea of these particular troops, which are not under the control of the Ministry of Defense, but which are supplied by the Ministry of Defense, both in the equipment and in officers, if they are eliminated, what makes the Wagner fighters any more important than Russian contract service personnel? And that is basically like the insight into the court politics. All of those people in the field are going to die, but their deaths at certain moments can have different political effects within the Russian leadership circles. That's essentially the core aspect of the system that Putin has created, is that people's incentives, like people like Gerasimov, people like Shoigu, Prigozhin, those incentives are not 100% aligned with each other, and they're not aligned with what Putin wants, which is victory right now.
Yeah. So let's actually had one last question for you here, and then see if there's anything else we want to cover before we wrap up. Which is Putin, right? We know what Putin wants, but among these sequences of events that we just talked about here, my question is, I guess, what Putin doing? Because you've had a number of very visible and destructive strikes on those oil supply storage areas. You had a direct attack on the Kremlin, which is like you aside from taking a shot at Putin himself, you can't have a more potential, aggressive attack if it was the Ukrainians against a symbol of Russian power. And then in the last 24 hours, we've had Prigozhin essentially call out Putin's decision making and leadership via his generals in all but name, right? But as I'm going back through this, I don't think we've seen Putin make any specific response to them. Which you could argue maybe just pretend the oil fires never happened and let his rivals fight it out. But I don't think he specifically came on camera or made any statements about the attack on the Kremlin, which would be potentially a direct attack on his authority. Why do you think we haven't had any sort of direct response from him? Is he saving it all for the May 9th victory parade, with the one soldier and one tank that's going to come out? Or is his absence in commenting on this does it indicate anything else?
When I was doing the research for my book, one of the questions was basically what's Putin's like leadership style? Like not the mystical, like what motivated him like as a child or like, experiences in East Germany, but when the guy has to make a decision, how does he go about it? And it became clear, and sort of like using that to then say, basically, how does he just understand the concept of reform, like making decisions to basically say, we're going to emphasize X, but not Y. We're going to choose A, but we're going to like leave B for the time being. And really, the thing that he's done for like decades at this point is he brings together basically individuals who represent very different points of view, very different policy ideas, whatever it is. And he basically, quite literally, will set them apart like across from a table and just have them argue it out. When it comes to economic reform, that sort of like makes sense. You just want to see like what's the battle of ideas here. So he has people basically duke it out. He then figures out basically like what are the bits and pieces of each one that he likes. And he then makes a decision that basically increases the power of the Russian state versus alternative actors. So, in this regard, what we're seeing right now is, I think, the same thing that he's been doing for decades. He doesn't know if Prigozhin is for real, because Prigozhin, for all of his bluster, basically still like 100% relies upon like the Russian state. He doesn't know basically like whether Shoigu and Gerasimov are doing anything actually useful in terms of prosecuting the war. What a lot of leaders would do is basically say, here's what I want, here's basically what we need to do, and try to actually bring government together to fulfill that vision. What Putin does is basically wait until a winner emerges and then take the credit for that. So the reason I believe we're not actually seeing Putin do anything or say anything is because he doesn't know what to do. And he's just waiting for more time until more information comes through so that he doesn't basically put the wrong foot forward, say something that doesn't turn out to be as defensible in the normal course of politics. It works well enough when it's not a crisis. When it's a crisis, we ask ourselves, what Putin doing?
And, yeah, I think that the tweet you sent me earlier this morning, I think really sort of captured that, which is like looking at these long lists of crises and like we're not seeing sort of Putin present in doing something or even commenting about it. You know, especially with again the attack on the Kremlin is probably the most direct, you know, middle finger somebody could give to the power of the Russian state there. And it was from Sergei Radchenko saying that Putin, like, it just looks like there's no captain at the ship, right? Nobody's really steering. Putin is, he's not just aloof letting them fight it out. He's just aloof, not doing anything. Um, and noted that between Prigozhin, Shoigu, Gerasimov, Patrushev, I'm not sure what incident he was referencing there, but the point is, you've got all these guys pursuing different lines of effort, you know, different interests, different agendas. None of which, again, is actually like, you know, winning the war most effectively. It's, you know, me first, maybe the war second. But he noted all these people, these chefs will cook some spicy dishes, and you know, fortunately, in I guess I'm going to probably overdo this metaphor, but when it comes to Russian activity, those spicy dishes are also fairly bloody and destructive. So it's not necessarily humorous, but the, you know, the larger point is it's these balls cannot all stay up in the air at some point, and this is a really bad time for this to be happening to them if they want to have a solid chance of containing Ukrainian counteroffensive. Having your generals and your private military contract or companies at each other's throats when that launches, not a great recipe for a good defensive outing.
At the end of the day, this is sort of shows Russian political culture is one in which leaders are successful when they get basically all the different factions of the elite to believe the life is better with them than without them. If they can make basically all those different, you know, elite stakeholders believe that tomorrow looks like today, there's no need to basically think of any alternatives, then the leader looks very strong. This is the basically, you know, the bully pulpit. This is, you know, um, the informal power of the presidency. When people start to believe the future is unknown and unknowable, the most natural thing to do is try to protect yourself first. And if you try to protect yourself first, you then get situations like this one in which you are working cross purposes with your rivals, because you may want to win, you may want to do whatever's in the public interest, but you certainly don't want to personally lose. And that sort of political competition, that is really sort of like strangling Russian decision making at this moment, because they're now in a position in which the most success that they've had in basically recent months is threatening to gather his toys and leave.
Does tomorrow look better than today? Will willingly cede a territory that you've expended massive amounts of blood and treasure to take. Definitely, that tomorrow will not look as good as whatever today is. Adding on top of that, does this chaos significantly reduce the Russian military's ability to hold the line anywhere against a concerted counteroffensive? If it can't, that tomorrow is going to look pretty crappy too. And this isn't even to talk about you've mentioned for months, the many balls in the air for the Russian economy are due to start coming down because they're slapping band-aids on stuff that can only temporarily stay bleeding. So in terms of whether they lose Bakhmut, lose massive amounts of territory in the counteroffensive, we haven't even talked about what happens when the economy comes crashing down, which I think you've mentioned. The outlook for the rest of this year and then going into next year, not good for the Russian economy. That tomorrow
Yes,
will not look good at all.
and we can do that in basically like the next episode, just going over where we are now that we've finished. Just for example, now that we've finished like the first quarter of 2023, the Russian state is no longer producing like aggregate commodity statistics. So the oil, the basically the oil price cap is working well enough that they're no longer releasing data on basically like the oil money.
Yeah, which is it's always been one of their main sources of income. So that's not a great tomorrow.
That's the last and best horse to ride. And if that horse starts going lame, we would observe like the death spiral of the Russian economy. Like I don't know when it's coming, but based on literally the status quo right now, it will come.
And that will be another spicy dish indeed to look at when that part of the table gets set. So I think, I think probably we're probably due for a look at what Russian economy doing here in the near future. So maybe we can target that for the next one. But otherwise, anything else we wanted to cover today? I think we hit all our themes.
A drone attack on the Kremlin, like science fiction brought to life.
I'm not trying to be reduce the severity of it, but the drone attack has generated a number of very interesting social media themes, to include saying, if Russia was going to release the footage, they should have at least released the footage from Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, where somebody like put an underground bomb and collapsed the whole thing. Conversely, somebody else also created a video of somebody throwing a battleship at the Kremlin and pieces of the boat, like the rudder and the propellers, like flying at it. Very, very dramatic. Maybe the footage isn't getting out to the Russian public, but it's been noted elsewhere.
Okay, attack on Kremlin, 23's surprise hit of the summer.
Indeed. And, as you said, there's a non-zero chance they did it to themselves. So who knows what we'll see out of that story. But, at this point, you could have freaking flying saucers come down into Red Square tomorrow, and I would not be surprised. Well, it's after 4:00 on a Friday, so I think we can both find more relaxing things to do. So we'll bid you adieu. You've all thank you again for another episode here, and we'll keep trying to get these out. I think about once a week for the foreseeable future. See how that tempo goes.
All right. Happy trails. Enjoy the weekend.
All right, you too. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.